Good morning.
Good morning.
Sermon part 1. I think I heard some people chuckle a little bit when I read the part in the gospel lesson where the nets started to break and the ships started to sink because there was just too many fish. It's interesting to see a case in which God has blessed so abundantly that it becomes a problem. This is the gospel version of too much of a good thing. The good news is that with the help of friends, they were able to work through this abundant gift. The good news for us from this story is that God does bless us abundantly. So much more abundantly sometimes than we could even possibly hope to use, even possibly hope to manage. But through the help of the church, through Christian community, through our neighbors, through those in need, we can share what we have, share the rich blessings of God so that all can be fed. Sermon part 2. When I was a kid, I'm not sure, I can't say with 100% certainty, but given the desire to have arts and crafts in every Sunday school curriculum and vacation Bible school curriculum that I ever went to, I'm almost certain that at one point we did this story and I colored a picture of a fisherman with one of those big fisherman hats and a fishing pole and brought it home to my parents and said, "Look, Jesus said we're fishing for people." Of course, at that age, I probably didn't actually understand that Peter was not casting a line with a fishing rod and reeling in fish. That's not how Peter fished. He threw a net from a boat and pulled some ropes and yanked in a bunch of fish. But at any point, I don't think at any point in my life did I think this was meant to be taken literally. Even as a kid, this is a great metaphor to teach metaphors to kids because it's so ridiculous. As a kid, I wasn't thinking that what Jesus was saying was, you're going to cast a line into a lake, start reeling, it's going to be really heavy. And then out pops, "Oh, hi, George. Have you heard the gospel today?" Furthermore, I have never once in my career preaching ever thrown a net on an unsuspecting congregation hoping that I could fish them into the gospel. Maybe I should try it sometime. I don't think it would go over well in most congregations. We know that this is not to be taken literally. We're fairly confident of that. No, this is a change. Jesus is saying you are fishermen no longer. Now you're doing something completely different. You're fishing for people. You are peopler men. You are people anglers? Tanglers? I don't know. But Jesus is giving them a new job, completely different from the job they had before. And while it might be metaphorically similar, it's not really literally similar in any way. They're not casting lines. They're not throwing nets on people. They're not fishing in any meaningful sense anymore. They're not working with fish. But I have a little bit of a problem with this. See, some would look at this and say, "Oh, good for them. They're getting out of the fishing industry and getting into the ministry. That's better, right?" But I don't know. Because catching a lot of fish feeds a lot of people. Now, Peter and Andrew and James and John certainly distributed a lot of food when Jesus had the miracle of feeding the 5,000, but they weren't producing it. Not like when they're catching the fish. They weren't getting it on people's plates right out of the water. And as apostles in the early church, they may have helped distribute food before they gave that job over to the deacons. They may have helped distribute food initially, but even then, they weren't making the food. Someone else was producing the food. Being a fisherman is not a bad job. It might be a gross or a stinky job for some of us, but it's not any worse job than the ministry. In some ways, it's better. I have not fed nearly as many people as a capable fisherman has. Same thing for farmers and ranchers and anyone else who produces food. See, for some reason, when Jesus feeds 5,000 people, we call it a miracle. But when Peter feeds 5,000 people over the course of a month with nothing but a boat and a net and some ropes, we say it's just work. This seems a little unfair. Peter's doing that good work, and in some sense, it's nothing short of miraculous. Because if someone would put me on a boat in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, I would not come up with loads of fish. There's tremendous skill in knowing how to do this job. It's something that many people could not do. Similarly, if someone would give me 100 acres of land and some farming equipment and some seeds, I would be lost. Personally, I'd be lost. I know who to talk to. Some people here I could talk to help me figure it out. But if I had no help, I would have no idea how to turn these into useful crops or where to go once I got them ready. This work, to someone who doesn't understand it, is nothing short of miraculous. It's a mystery. And yet, we trust fishermen and farmers and ranchers and all of these other food producers to put this food on our table. It is an amazing thing. So it seems weird that a lot of people look at this story and think, great, they're getting out of fishing and getting into something more meaningful. Because fishing is very meaningful. Not everyone can drop their jobs and become a pastor. If everyone that I'm talking to right now quit their work at the peak of their career to go to seminary, I think the world would be worse for it. Some of us need to be farmers and teachers and everything else. Someone needs to do those jobs. It's no more honorable, no more holy to go learn about God and stand up here and preach. It does not make us any better or worse. It's just a different job. But then when you look at this story and you think, man, fishing was actually a really good thing. They were feeding a lot of people when they were fishing. They were helping a lot of people when they were fishing. It almost seems wrong that they were taken out of this job. But as much as I started this sermon by saying, obviously, literally, they did not continue fishing, in some ways, those same skills still apply. Now, there is a story in which someone comes up to them and asks them to pay the temple tax, and Jesus tells Peter to go catch a fish and open the fish's mouth, and the coin for the tax will be in the fish's mouth, that's an interesting story for sure, and Peter's still fishing, but I think there's an even better story. All of you will certainly recall, at one point, there's this great story in the Gospels where they're sailing across the Sea of Galilee, this big lake, and they get caught in a storm. Jesus is asleep, and the other disciples are frantically trying to get through the storm. Now here's the thing about Jesus being asleep. At least my generation has this joke about Jesus take the wheel. When things are going bad, we just say, Jesus take the wheel, and that's supposed to save us. But Jesus did not have this wheel. Jesus wasn't anywhere near the rudder of this ship. Jesus was asleep. He was not doing anything. The disciples were. And specifically, you can probably imagine it was the disciples who already knew their way around a boat. Similar to farming, if someone would stick me on a sailboat in the middle of a lake and say, get to shore, and didn't tell me how to work the thing, I'd think, do you have a paddle? What am I supposed to do? I don't know how to sail. I don't know how to hoist a line and whatever. I don't know what I'm doing. And one could imagine that Matthew, one of the disciples, who was a tax collector, probably also didn't know what he was doing in this situation. Way out of his depth. So one could possibly imagine Peter saying, all right, guys, the wind is picking up. We need to take the sail into the second reef and set the oars, and then oars so that we don't get shaken to pieces by the wind. And, Simon the Zealot is sitting there going, you want us to do what? With the sail? And then Matthew's saying, we have oars? And then Jesus is sitting there sleeping. At that point, Jesus entrusted the work of sailing this ship across the sea to his disciples. They knew how to do it because they had been fishermen. He called fishermen, and the result of that is they could get back and forth across the sea while Jesus rested. And it's true that when things got really dire, Jesus calmed the storm, settled the sea down, made it possible for them to continue sailing. But Jesus never took the rudder of the ship. Jesus never played with the halyards and did anything to the sail. That was Peter and James and John and Andrew. That was the disciples who knew how to sail. Their ability to sail made it possible for Jesus' ministry to go back and forth across this inland sea. It made it possible for the gospel to spread quickly and safely in a very effective way. God called fishermen to continue using the skills that they had as fishermen, even when they were disciples, spreading the word around. All of us have at least two vocations from God. We are called as baptized members of the church to engage in the mission of the baptized, to serve the world and proclaim the good news. And we are also called to whatever job we do, whether that be a farmer, a volunteer firefighter, a nurse, doctor, lawyer, teacher, plumber, carpenter, whatever it may be. Now, of course, we might also be called to the vocation of being a parent or being a public servant in some way, but we all have at least these two things. We have the job we do in our daily life, and we have the mission as a member of the church. God calls us to both of these things because they help each other. As a member of the church, we can see God at work in our work, whatever it happens to be. We can see God feeding the world when we're farming. We can see God curing the sick when we're helping people as doctors and nurses. We can see God teaching future generations when we teach children. We can see God at work in our lives, in the world. And at the same time, our vocation informs our call to ministry, our baptized mission. Because as whatever we're doing, that makes us better at sharing the gospel. That gives us some skills, some gifts that we wouldn't otherwise have. And God entrusts us to take care of these things. God can feed the world without ever having to get into a combine because God has entrusted that work to farmers. God can cure the sick without ever having to stick stethoscope things in his ears because God has entrusted that work to doctors. God can represent the poor and downtrodden in a legal sense without ever stepping into a courtroom because God has entrusted that work to lawyers, hopefully good, ethical lawyers. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in our world, and God calls us to it, to fully embrace not only our call as baptized members of the church, but also our call as whatever God calls us to be. Fishermen can be just as important as apostles. And sometimes doing both is the most powerful thing we have in learning about the manifold wisdom of God and God's radical love for the world, but also understanding our place in God's kingdom. Thanks be to God for these many vocations. Amen.